11:47 p.m. 2 days after the funeral. 4 words on the phone screen. White against black. I'm not dead. Come. No caller ID. Blocked number. My thumb froze over the glass while I sat on the edge of the bed in the dress I'd buried my mother in, hem still carrying cemetery mud. I read it once. Then again. I'm not dead. Come. A second buzz hit before I could breathe. GPS pin. Cemetery. My hands shook so hard the phone rattled against my nails. I opened the contact list, then the thread. Nothing. No name, no history, no trace. Like some ghost had reached through the screen and left wet fingerprints behind. 3 days earlier, we buried Catherine Harlan on a Friday. Closed casket, my father insisted. He said Savannah had been too severe, no daughter should see her mother like that, and everyone in the room nodded because that's what people do when Richard Harlan speaks. They nod, and they look away. He didn't cry. Not at the viewing, not at the service, not at the graveside, where mud grabbed at my heels and white lilies curled in 90-degree heat. His face stayed smooth, controlled, the face of a man finishing a task, not losing a wife. Then he left. Straight from the reception. Didn't change clothes. Didn't sit with me. Didn't pour a drink and collapse into grief the way a husband of 26 years was supposed to. He drove to the coast with a woman whose name I'd only heard in whispers from housekeepers who kept their eyes on the floor when they said it. My mother had been in the ground 4 hours. My father was already gone. So when the text came, something in me didn't break. It clicked into place, like a gear waiting all along. I grabbed my keys. I didn't call anyone. There was no one I trusted enough to hear my voice shake. Rain started 10 minutes outside the city, hard enough to erase lane markers and turn headlights into pale smears. Funeral flowers sat in the back seat, white roses, browning at the edges. Sweetness and decay. Every breath in that car tasted like both. I kept looking in the rearview mirror. Not because I thought someone followed me, because for a week before, I'd felt watched inside my own house. Doors my father locked that had never been locked before. His office light burning at 3 a.m. Richard studying my face at breakfast like he was measuring what I knew and how much longer he could hide it. What I knew then? Almost nothing. What I felt? Enough to keep my stomach tight all the way down the highway. The cemetery gate stood open when I reached it. It shouldn't have. They chain it at sundown. I rolled through, killed the headlights, and sat in the dark while rain hammered the roof so hard it sounded like fists. GPS pin pointed to the east plot. My mother's plot. I saw her before my mind agreed to it. A woman stood at the foot of the grave, with her name on it. Thin. Soaked through. Shoulders drawn in like she was trying to disappear into the rain. I knew that posture. Not from grief. From years of making herself smaller so someone else could feel taller. I opened the door. Cold rain struck my face. She turned. My mother's eyes. My mother's hands. My mother's voice, cracked and barely louder than the storm. Don't scream. Please. I didn't. My knees just gave way. She caught me before I hit the ground, and her fingers were warm. Alive. Real. Not a memory. Not some midnight hallucination from grief. Catherine Harlan was standing at her own grave, breathing, shaking, and terrified of something far worse than death. We can't stay here, she whispered. He checks things. He checks everything. Then she took my wrist and pulled me toward old caretaker's shed at edge of property, and I followed. Because what else do you do when dead come back and ask you to walk with them? Inside, she sat on overturned crate. I stayed standing. My legs felt borrowed. How? One word. That's all my mouth could make. She looked at me, and something in her eyes said she had been rehearsing this moment for months. And dreading it just as long. Your father told me I would disappear, she said. Quiet. Measured. Like sentence had been sharpened in her mouth for weeks. He told me it was already arranged. The property transfers, the accounts, the timing, all of it was set. And when it was done, I wouldn't be needed anymore. Rain hammered tin roof. I could hear my own pulse under it. So I disappeared first. She reached into coat and pulled out folded paper. An address. A code. 7 digits I knew by heart. Richard's office safe, the one no one was ever allowed to touch. "If you love me," she said, "don't cry." Document. She pressed a second folded paper into my hand, a copy of the first transfer, already notarized by a witness Richard had never met, already time-stamped, already sent to an attorney in Charleston who was waiting for my call. And if you've ever had ground split open under whole life, you know that sound. Like something inside you goes still, because it has to. The woman I had buried 3 days ago was the only person standing between me and what my father had already decided to do next. Everything I had called my childhood had just become evidence, and my father was still smiling at the coast, certain he had buried the only person who knew it. That comes in part 2. Rain ran down Catherine's face in thin lines. When she said my father's name, Richard, her mouth twisted like the syllables tasted of something rotten. We moved fast. Across the cemetery path, past the maintenance shed with its rusted padlock, into a caretaker's cottage that hadn't been used in years. She had a key. That told me she'd been planning this longer than I wanted to believe. Inside, one lamp, a sleeping bag, 2 duffel bags, silence so heavy I could hear my own pulse in my teeth. "Sit down," she said. I didn't. "How long?" My voice came out flat, unfamiliar. "How long has he been doing this to you?" Catherine pulled a binder from beneath the sleeping bag. Manila folder, thick, edges soft from handling. She opened it on the floor between us. What I saw inside rearranged every memory I had of my father's house. It started 14 months after the wedding, and she told me the small things first. The ones that sound reasonable when you say them out loud. The ones that don't sound like anything at all until you're already inside them. He framed it as a tax strategy. Her parents' estate was complex, he said. 3 states, overlapping trusts, and a joint structure would protect her from exposure she didn't understand. He said it once, then twice, then built a spreadsheet showing her the risk of doing nothing, and by the time she recognized the argument as a door closing, the account was already zeroed and her signature was already on the consolidation form. By month 3, her parents' calls went to a phone Richard monitored. She showed me the log, a spreadsheet she'd kept in secret. Dates and incidents cataloged in tiny handwriting on receipt paper because he checked her devices. The mechanic was someone Richard had used before. I found that out later. April, the hardware unit went in. She didn't know until June, when she drove 40 minutes to her college roommate's house, and Richard called before she pulled into the driveway, not angry, just asking, casually, what route she'd taken. She said the highway. He said nothing, but that trip was the last one. By August, the invitation had become a line item he'd flagged as discretionary, and she had stopped arguing about discretionary things. She stopped, pressed her knuckles against her mouth. I waited. By August, he presented the first set of transfer documents, $40 million. Her parents had built it across 3 states, brick by brick, before the Savannah crash took them both, and Catherine had inherited every acre, every deed, every dollar. I had eaten at that dining room table. I had called Walter and Margaret my grandparents. Richard had been dissolving them through a chain of entities Catherine had never heard of, and I had been sitting in that house, passing the potatoes, noticing nothing. She refused to sign. Aunts. What followed wasn't violence. It was architecture. He restructured every exit, changed the house alarm codes without telling her, moved her car keys to his office, replaced her phone with a new one already configured to mirror to his laptop. I didn't have a name for it then. I only had the image of my mother photographing a grocery receipt in the parking lot before she came inside, deleting the photo before she reached the kitchen, and still getting the timestamp wrong by 2 minutes, which was enough for 3 days of questions she answered, standing at the sink, not turning around. He never hit me. Her voice dropped to a whisper. Not once. But I stopped sleeping. I started photographing every receipt before I spent anything, then destroying the photo, because he cross-referenced my spending against store timestamps, and I had learned, by then, that a 2-minute gap was enough to make him ask questions for 3 days. Something moved through me that wasn't grief and wasn't anger. It was the specific, nauseating recognition of a man I had called my father standing behind a chair, not touching her, just present. The way a locked door is present. 3 documents. She signed them in January, sitting at the dining room table where I'd eaten Thanksgiving dinner 6 weeks earlier. Richard stood behind her chair, not touching her, just present, the way a locked door is present. After I signed the third one, something broke. Catherine's fingers traced the edge of the binder. Not loud, quiet, like a wire snapping inside a wall where nobody can see. She started planning that same week, not with rage, because rage would have shown, but with a spreadsheet, a burner phone, and a Charleston attorney who had already filed a fraudulent transfer claim against 3 of Richard's shell entities before the ink on the third signature was dry. By the time Richard drove back from the coast, 2 of those entities had been frozen by a judge he had never met, and my mother had not said a single word at dinner. She found the women who had done it quietly, who had let a man believe the ending he expected while they were already 3 states away building a different one. She told me that, not as a statistic, as a calculation she had made about her own life, about how much time she had left before the first act of physical violence was also the last thing that ever happened to her, preceded only by the kind of control Richard had already perfected and documented, now, in a binder, sitting in a caretaker's cottage, time-stamped and notarized, with copies in 3 cities he didn't know existed. Catherine understood she might not get a second warning. Every detail mattered. Not the dramatic gestures, those leave traces. She had studied the gap between a man's certainty and his paperwork, and she had already placed something inside it that he would never find until it was too late. A witness who had signed nothing under her real name, a car found at the coast with the door open and the engine still warm, and a transfer of assets, already recorded in Charleston, that predated the accident by 11 days. He told me once that if I ever tried to leave, I would disappear. She looked at me, so I made that true on my own terms. Her hands were steady now. Mine were not. I looked at the binder. Dates, names, account numbers, transfer routing codes. She had built this the way someone builds a life, one quiet decision at a time. A lifeboat, plank by plank, in the dark while the ship was still pretending to float. The safe, I said. She nodded. Everything I've shown you tonight is a copy. The originals, the ones that would hold up in any courtroom, are inside that office, along with things I was never meant to find. Catherine looked at me with an expression I will carry for the rest of my life. Not fear. Something past it, the place you arrive when fear has already done its worst and left you standing. That safe holds more than money, she said. A pause so long the rain outside seemed to stop. It holds why my parents died. She reached into the second duffel bag and set a manila envelope on the floor between us, already addressed to the Chatham County District Attorney, sealed, stamped, and waiting only for the originals I was going to retrieve from my father's safe before he woke up. I already knew I was going into that house alone. 2:11 in the morning. I pushed open my father's office door without knocking. The hallway carpet swallowed my footsteps whole. Down the hall. His bedroom door stayed shut. Through the wall came that mechanical wheeze of his sleep apnea machine, steady as a metronome. He was under leather, old bourbon, something metallic underneath that I'd never let myself identify before tonight. The desk lamp clicked on, spilling gold across mahogany where he'd signed away other people's lives for 30 years. Behind the oil painting of Charleston Harbor, because of course it was behind the painting, the safe waited. 7 digits. I'd memorized them at 19, watching his fingers in the hallway mirror's reflection while I pretended to fix an earring. He never caught me looking. 14 years I carried those numbers like a splinter lodged too deep to extract, never understanding why I'd bothered to remember. Now I knew. The dial turned smooth. Click, click, click. Tumblers falling like dominoes in a story that had been waiting since I was a teenager to finally get told. The door swung open. 3 shelves. Bottom shelf, property documents. 7 of them. Spread across 3 South Carolina counties and 2 in Georgia. Catherine's signature on every deed. But the ink pressure was wrong on 4, loops too sharp, spacing mechanical. I'd seen her real handwriting in that cemetery shed. These weren't even close. Middle shelf, a burner phone, powered off, resting on top of a manila folder thick enough to stop a door. Inside, offshore banking correspondence. Cayman accounts routed through a Delaware shell company. Transfer amounts just under 8 figures, broken into increments designed to slip past federal reporting thresholds. $9,500 here. $9,800 there. Dozens of them. My father hadn't just stolen from Catherine. He built an entire financial architecture to make her parents' wealth disappear into accounts only he could touch. Top shelf. One item. A microcassette tape in a plastic evidence bag. Handwritten date on the label. March 3rd, 2009. 15 years ago. I picked it up. My hands stayed steady. They should have shaken, should have trembled, should have dropped it. But something in me had moved past shaking into a place where your body goes very still because your mind has already accepted what's coming. His recorder sat in the second desk drawer. I pressed play. My father's voice filled the room. Walter, I'm going to explain this once. Calm. Measured. The same voice I'd heard at 1,000 dinner tables, except every ounce of warmth had been surgically removed. You sign the easement, or I make the Savannah property worthless to you. And I don't mean through litigation. Walter Aldridge's response came thin and strained, a man trying to reason with someone who'd already decided. Richard, this land has been in Margaret's family for. I know exactly whose family it belonged to. A pause. Ice clinking against glass. Past tense is going to become very relevant to you, Walter. 4 minutes. 11 seconds. By the end, my father had described, in precise, unhurried detail, what would happen to the Aldridge family's holdings, their credit, their reputation, and their ability to drive safely on I-16 if they refused to comply. 3 weeks after that recording was made, Walter and Margaret Aldridge died in a single-vehicle accident on Interstate 16 outside Savannah. I stood there in his office, holding a cassette tape that might as well have been a murder weapon, while his sleep apnea machine hummed through the wall like nothing had changed. I didn't scream. What I did? Pulled out my phone, photographed every document, front and back, recorded the audio cassette playing through with a second device for digital backup, wrote chain of custody notes in my memo app, timestamps, descriptions, exact positions of every item. Catherine had told me to document, so I documented. By 3:40 a.m., I had duplicated everything. Originals returned to their exact positions. Safe locked, painting rehung, lamp off. The office looked untouched. By sunrise, encrypted files sat with an attorney Catherine had vetted months before her staged death, a woman in Colombia who specialized in financial crimes and domestic coercion. Through her, a federal tip submission went out before noon. My name appeared nowhere on the initial filing. What I learned later, offenders who exercise this kind of daily control over a partner are more than 5 times more likely to kill them. In 20% of domestic homicides, the murder is the very first act of physical violence, but coercive, controlling behavior always comes first. Catherine hadn't been paranoid. She'd been statistically rational. Breakfast the next morning required the performance of my life. Eggs scrambled soft, coffee black, newspaper folded to the business section. His routine, maintained like scripture. I sat across from him and smiled the way daughters smile at fathers they still trust. He ate slowly, talked about the weather, the market, a fundraiser next month. Normal. Easy. The man who'd threatened to kill his in-laws now discussing whether the azaleas needed pruning. Then he set down his fork, studied my face with an expression I'd never seen before, or maybe one I'd always seen but never had the language to name. Calculating. Measuring. The same voice from that tape, wrapped in a cashmere sweater and reading glasses. You were up late last night, he said. My coffee cup didn't waver. Couldn't sleep. Grief does that. Long silence. He picked up his fork. Stopped. You look like your mother, he said. When she learned too much. The fork resumed. He kept eating. Somewhere beneath the table, my phone buzzed once. A message from the attorney. 3 words I couldn't yet read, while my father chewed his breakfast 6 feet away from the daughter who was about to dismantle everything he'd built. I didn't look down. Not yet. The coffee burned my palm through the mug when engine noise rolled up the drive. 3 black SUVs came first, slow and deliberate beneath the magnolias, gravel popping under their tires like a metronome counting down. Two unmarked sedans followed tight behind. Then a local news van drifted in at the back, satellite masts still folded, like somebody had tipped them off before the breakfast plates were even rinsed. I stood at the kitchen window with a dish towel over my shoulder and watched the line of vehicles settle into place. Same feeling as tracking a storm for days, then seeing the first wall of rain hit your own porch. Upstairs, my father was shaving. I could hear the bathroom fan through the vent and his low, tuneless humming between razor strokes, the sound of a man still sure his house, his money, his name, all of it, could hold weight forever. The knock came once. Hard. Official. Wood shuddered in the frame. He didn't hear it. I did. I opened the door because he was still upstairs, and because I wanted to be the first face they saw. Both can sit in same truth. Four agents stood shoulder to shoulder, jackets open, badges visible. One held a warrant folded so clean it looked like a church bulletin. "We're here for Richard Harlan. He's upstairs," I said. My voice stayed level. My fingers stayed still on doorknob brass. But behind my ribs, something that had stayed knotted for weeks loosened all at once. Not happiness, not relief, only that raw, hollow pull of a breath finally leaving body after being held too long. He came down in reading glasses and a half-buttoned cashmere sweater, razor still in his right hand, foam at jawline. Smile appeared before understanding did, smooth, social, automatic. Same smile from hospital fundraisers, club dinners, donor galas. Charm first, facts later. Smile lasted maybe 4 seconds. Agents read charges while house staff gathered in hallway, silent, eyes fixed on floorboards and cuffs and polished banister. Financial fraud. Forgery tied to property transfer documents. Wire fraud linked to offshore accounts. Conspiracy under broader federal investigation. Every charge struck with dull weight, like nails driven into oak. He always called indestructible. He reached for old tools in old order. First, denial, controlled, almost amused. "This is a misunderstanding." Then rank. "Get me your supervisor." Then cuffs clicked shut around his wrists, and a look crossed his face I had never seen before. Recognition. Not remorse. Men like him don't leap to remorse. What hit him was recognition that control had moved. Real control. Control he used on Catherine, on my mother. On every room he entered for decades. It no longer sat in his voice or his wallet or his last name. It sat in signed warrants, audit trails, copied files, chain of custody, people trained not to flinch when powerful men mispronounced their names on purpose. As they turned him toward door, he looked back once. "Lena," he said softly, same tone from my childhood when he wanted me to fetch something and call it love. I held his eyes. No blink. No answer. Door shut. Latch clicked. Camera shutters fired before he reached first step. By driveway, microphones were already up, red tally lights blinking in cold morning air. No slow motion ending waited after that. Phones started within hour. Attorneys first. Then relatives by noon, voices sharp with urgency, none asking if Catherine was safe, none asking what he had done. Same request, dressed 10 different ways, protect family name, as if family name had not been weapon for years before it ever became headline. Through counsel, Catherine gave statement from protected location. Alive, guarded, precise. Every page I copied from his safe locked into her timeline, the forged signatures, property transfers, pressure points, controlled accounts, money turned on and off like oxygen. Financial strangulation, isolation by paperwork, threat without bruises. Courts now have language for it. Coercive control. Not marital conflict. Not rough season. Pattern. Entrapment. Risk profile with blood at end if nobody interrupts it. My father never hit her. He never needed to. She paints in mornings now. Small watercolors on thick paper, edges curled in salt air, propped against weathered railings while tide redraws shoreline inch by inch. She titles each one with date, not worst dates, not courtroom dates, but days after. Days she chose breath over fear. On a Tuesday, I took flowers to my mother's grave. Wet earth smell, cut stems in my hand, wind moving through cedar. I stayed long enough for silence to stop feeling like obedience. Said things I couldn't say while he still owned version of our grief. Then I drove home, my home, not his. Past Iron Gate where SUVs lined up that morning, past foyer where steel closed around his wrists. He thought disappearance belonged to him. He was wrong. He taught us weapon. We learned aim. If this landed somewhere familiar in your chest, stay with me. Next week's story cuts deeper.